how do we harness the mind sciences to help create conditions for kind of equity, belonging, and success in whatever context we're in. And so the theory that we've been working on within education, and this is so consistent with what the amazing student leader said at the beginning of the day, is in any context, but of course in education, what students and teachers need to thrive is a sense of belonging, to feel a sense that their people are respected, that they're invested in to an equal degree, obviously regardless of identity group, that there are conversations about the things that matter, again, particularly around issues of power, identity, gender, and other kinds of contexts in which conversations often don't occur.
I think that we should just be mindful that the smallest interaction with a teacher and a student can be the most, can be huge in that student's life. Mm-hmm. And it's that understanding where you become more critical to the things that you do and the things that you say.
Motivation research tells us that when students are not pressured to think, feel, and act in a certain way, they're more engaged. And the reason why this is particularly important for adolescents is because this idea of autonomy is a basic psychological need, right? But this need for autonomy becomes heightened as students progress throughout adolescence. And so according to stage environment fit theory, adolescents will learn what is to be learned in spaces where their needs are met because they're going to engage more in those spaces and choose to be in those spaces. A second idea here is about legitimacy, and research on rightful presence teaches us that leveraging students' cultural insights matters because it signals to a student that this environment is for me. And so one way that cultural insights can be leveraged is by students collecting their own data in communities or in their schools and then interpreting it from their lens. But the key here is that their perspectives are legitimized and they are seen as valid and valuable to the conversation. And it's not someone imposing their perspective on students, but actually understanding why you would perceive this way based on how this environment looks and feels to you.
I feel like there isn't a real structure to connect with students put in place. Mm-hmm. I know in my experience of even doing my advocacy work, whenever I had the opportunity to testify in City Hall, I would have to miss some sort of a portion of my school in order to be there. And when I'm there, we have to wait for everybody to speak and then the young people can speak.
Why is adolescence important? For a lot of reasons, and I think I don't need to convince this crowd about why adolescence is important. But a few things that make it particularly unique is that it's highly sensitive to the environment. And as we heard in the previous panel, the environment has a lot to do with what people do with their time, with how they learn and what they learn about. This makes the adolescent brain highly adaptive to changes. The ability to change based on changing social landscapes. The adaptability, heterogeneity, and plasticity of the brain, so plasticity meaning the ability to change in response to environmental input, both positive and negative environmental input. These factors generate opportunities for adolescents to thrive. That rather than thinking about plasticity of the adolescent brain as a pathology or something, a negative attribute, the field in neuroscience, thankfully, is really shifting the narrative to really appreciate how important this is for helping adolescents thrive.
No, we're not disengaged. We've been disempowered. We've been taught, it's constantly trying to find our voice in a system that, like Jessica, you mentioned, is constantly reinforcing that we don't have a voice to begin with. And a lot what I'm hoping is that the way I thought about it and the way I still think about it is that I would talk to my student voice committee members and be well, in terms of power distribution, it's very much a totem pole. In terms of students are here, whoever the higher ups of the education system here. But the way I would always reframe it was but without us, there's none of the higher ups. We are the base of all the power. We're the base of everything from there.
So adultism is a disease we all have that builds with age. And so I'm 44 years old and pretty open with how old I am. I have a 15-year-old son who every day reminds me, even though I do this work at MCFA Challenge, of how adultist I am, right? My experience now as a 44-year-old is even though I have the story of self, is still, though, guided by the fact that I'm upper income, middle class. I can carve and control my spaces. And I'm in a position of power. I'm the CEO of a nonprofit, right? And so when we say things to young people like get over it, suck it up, it's not that big of a deal. That is our adultism creeping in of not honoring what that young person is going through and diminishing their everyday lived experience.
So I wanted to start off with this slide of an image of a self-portrait, right? It's an elementary school age child. I believe it was a first grader. And if that's all I tell you, there's really nothing extraordinary about this self-portrait, developmentally appropriate. But if I give you a little more context, the self-portrait was made by a child of Mexican descent with dark brown eyes, dark brown hair, and brown skin, right? And so the teacher, who happens to be a collaborator of mine and also an ethnic studies teacher, would see this in her students quite a bit. And she would ask them, why did you draw yourself that way? And the students would consistently say something like, because I want to be beautiful, right? And blonde hair and blue eyes is beautiful. So I chose this as the opening image because we've talked a lot about or heard a lot about adolescence, but these socially transmitted messages hit very early on, and we are all susceptible. Media, movies, books, the way we're portrayed or where we're not portrayed is internalized by all of us, right? And so this teacher, lucky for these students, right, had a very deep background in asset-based pedagogy, and so they ended up doing something like this, right, later on when she engaged with them. And so she would have them mix paints to match the color of their skin. You can see this beautiful little poem that the child wrote. And the key thing here, right, is there was a lot that went into this. It wasn't just draw yourself the way you really are, right? There was authentic relationship building. There was co-construction of knowledge and really listening to the students, but knowing a lot about what the school system does and does not give our students. So it isn't just standards of beauty, right, that we internalize. There are messages about what language is validated and for whom. We have students who speak Spanish at home, and they are told that they should not speak Spanish. You go up to the suburbs, and there's Spanish immersion schools for other students, right? So there's another way to look at this in terms of deficit views. In education, we call these students English learners, rather than multilingual, bilingual students, which is what they are, right? We heard this morning, right, that students of color, marginalized students, are not often in the curriculum. They're not even in picture books, right? So we often hear people saying parents should read with their children, but children are not even seeing themselves in picture books.
Misha, we're hearing so much now in the news and other places about the importance of Black teachers. So what advice would you give to funders and other organizations looking to support school districts in this work and retaining?
Right. So the retention is, similar to what we're talking about with student voice, listening to Black teachers. Black teachers will tell you what they need to stay, not the least of which is revamping of this credentialing process. So all of the challenges that we know around testing for young people, we see this happen with adults. The amount of, the cost of being a teacher today, the connection to housing, if you're talking about teaching in urban places where a lot of Black teachers are teaching, and leadership opportunities, right? So why do Black teachers leave? Black teachers leave at a higher rate than any other demographic. It's a feeling of isolation. It's a lack of leadership. It's high expectations without power, right? So listening to Black teachers, really creating opportunities for districts to revamp their professional development where they're able to understand which Black teachers have been successful and why. So again, it's not just, I always tell teachers in our network, you have to do more than just show up as Black, right? But really understanding and having the ability to reflect on your practice and to think about how we are differentiating our professional development and creating culturally responsive professional development and really supporting that. Because what it means, to your point, for a Black teacher who may have grown up in a particular environment that's different than the Black students they teach, there are a whole bunch of assumptions about, oh, you're going to connect because your melanin is close.
Right.
And actually, I'm dealing with my own internalized oppression, and there's no space for me to talk about that.
Right.
So really thinking about how we see the professional development work that we do as part of our human development.
So I guess I wanted to start with the part about what's generally not understood. And I think that we have this frame that culture and learning matter for brown people, right? And I maintain scientifically learning is inherently cultural for everyone, right? It's just that schools are set up to be predominantly Eurocentric and middle class centric, and so the cultural nature of learning goes invisible, right? But learning as a process happens with social others, in culturally constructed environments, towards culturally organized ends and goals. It is inherently cultural in nature. We learn, you alluded to this a minute ago, we learn by connecting the new things we learn onto the old things we already know, which come from our participation in cultural practices across the spaces of our lives, right? So, and if that's true, then culturally relevant or culturally responsive pedagogy should actually just be the norm. It should actually be just good pedagogy. And we have to call it something because it happens so rarely for Black, brown, and low-income students. I would also just add, kind of by way of principle, that we also know that when school communities set equity as a goal and put the structures and practices in place to make that happen, learning happens. So it's not this thing that we can't attain. And then for a wonderful example.
I'll give another story that sort of relates to what Naila is talking about. So Morehouse College is a historically Black male institution, founded in the 1800s, obviously, when slaves were emancipated. And from a cultural lens, in terms of thinking from the racial side, we think about the history and the legacy and sort of what that means pedagogically. It's like a huge boarding school. We have about 2,000 students. I think what that does in a classroom space is not only are you teaching students, but you sort of know what's going on in the dorms because there's an email that went around from the administrators. You see your students walking down Brown Street. And I think it sort of creates this environment where it's impossible almost in terms of my own teaching to separate the two, where it's my students' lives and my lives become sort of one in the classroom. I think in terms of the pedagogical aspects and sort of the teaching, it's really providing that room for students to show up. So I'm thinking about the story that you talked about with the students sort of showing up late. It's like, what does that mean, in terms of a math classroom? Why are we here? What is the point? Is it for you to learn this, this tool or strategy, or is it for you to come and learn something for your longer term goals? I think a lot of what I talked about in the introduction about vulnerability is something that I value, and sort of accountability with that vulnerability. So it creates these conditions where students get to hold me accountable, I get to hold them accountable, but we also have sort of some love underlying that. I think in a math classroom, they're not used to that.
So very, very important. There's 4 parts of pedagogy: purpose, context, content, and method. Sometimes people think pedagogy is just teaching method. Actually, that's super problematic because then a teacher goes, oh, my pedagogy is group work. That's not pedagogy, right? And Paulo Freire would have rolled over in his grave thinking, that is not pedagogy, right? So ultimately, pedagogy is rooted in a purpose. And the purpose for ethnic studies pedagogy is to get rid of racism. I don't know that that's very complex, but some people have been confused about what ethnic studies is. Ultimately, ethnic studies is to eliminate racism and other forms of oppression. But the centralization is to eliminate racism because that is one of the major things that's impacting our lives and the lives of people of color. Also, it is a centralization of Native peoples and communities of color to do that. In terms of context, it's really essential to take whatever the curriculum is and make it contextual. We already heard that in the last panel. And then, important enough, that the histories, the cultures, intellectual traditions of Native peoples and people of color are centralized in the curriculum, but not just centralized, because you could teach ethnic studies and about people of color and not give voice to people of color. So kind of leaning on the theme is not only are you saying that you need to include Native peoples and communities of color in the curriculum, you're gonna do it in first person if it's real ethnic studies. In first person, that means that people of color are speaking for themselves.
There are psychological mediators that are behind ethnic studies. I've been particularly drawn to the idea that culturally relevant pedagogy broadly really resembles an unusually intensive and sustained social psych intervention. And this conjecture came to me when we saw the ethnic studies impact. And it kind of set me back on my feet. What could be going on here theoretically? Well, I was aware of everything that's been going on in social psychology, where studies have shown little 15-minute interventions that forewarn people about stereotypes, give them external attribution for the challenges they face, that affirm their values in a classroom setting, give them growth mindset, or promote school belongingness. All of those have shown some promise. Again, these very targeted little 15-minute interventions. And it occurred to me, culturally relevant pedagogy embeds all of these together. It's social psych interventions on steroids. It's combining all of those levers, not in a 15-minute sort of injection, but rather it's embedded in a class that meets every day, all year. So, and also the fact that it was targeted at 9th grade may have also been felicitous. These social psych studies make a big point about, let's situate these interventions when kids are at this kind of transition where their social identity in the highly evaluative context of classrooms and schools is really uncertain and malleable.
Something that came up is that when implementing on a larger scale ethnic studies, there really needs to be that attention to detail when it comes to teacher training, because ethnic studies and decolonized education can't be taught in a colonized way. It just won't work. So if you're still using the same racist assessments, if you're still using those benchmark standards that are measuring students on their ability to assimilate to whiteness standards instead of actually their critical thinking, problem solving skills, or if you're teaching in a way that uses like the kind of banking concept model of education where you are just inputting historical facts down a student's throat, it's not going to make an impact. It doesn't matter what you're teaching. If you're teaching it in a colonized way, you are still colonizing.
So what are some of the challenges facing teacher learning with a focus on feedback? We know very few things in cognitive science really well, but one thing we really do know is the importance of feedback, right? Feedback needs to be objective, quick, and discriminating. So if you just have practice without feedback, you have this plateau. You improve, and this is exactly the kind of curve you see in teacher professional development and learning, including my own. But you need a specific type of feedback and practice engineered where you work in stages. This is how you become a great soccer player or a great swimmer, right? But this takes consistent feedback.
The teachers that we worked with, in terms of equity issues tied to social markers, they're receiving very little feedback. What they usually get are end-of-year test performance data broken down by race, for example, or language proficiency. But what they're not getting is data at the level of everyday classroom practice. So I think when you get that sort of broad, kind of not moment-to-moment data, I think the teachers we work with, they tend to find it easier to explain those data away. But when they're getting data when it's exactly what happened that day in your room, right? Because you call them that kid, and et cetera. It's a lot harder for them to dismiss that.
I think one of the things that's really important, or that we really need to think about doing, is developing a collaborative critical friend spirit within our K-12 settings, right? The ways in which we can get teachers to work together to visit and observe each other's classrooms and really learn from each other in meaningful ways. I think that's something that's missing. It oftentimes is just very other-directed, and it fails to understand the skill set, right, and the professional abilities that our teachers intrinsically have based on their preparation.
A structure that was integrated into the high-tech high system that we felt was really representative of student voice was the hiring process. So when new teachers were to be hired at high-tech high, they had to go through a multiple round application, and their interview consisted of teaching a sample class in front of students, and at the end all the students would write a reflection about how they felt about this educator and if they felt they would belong into our high-tech high environment, what they liked, what they disliked. And then the educator was also put through a student interview. And so on multiple occasions, Issa and I were able to be those advocates for what we believed our school needed. And at the time, especially when we were getting ready to graduate, after having built all this momentum of ethnic studies and culturally responsive pedagogy, we decided what our school needs are educators who have a background in ethnic studies and who know ethnic studies. And so from that, we were able to give a lot of input, and through these interviews, we were able to, what we believe really impact who is being hired. And now we have multiple educators at our school who were not there before, who have an experienced background in ethnic studies and who are actively contributing to this movement that we started at our campus.
It's someone said the question earlier about how do you elevate this when you have sort of voices pushing this way and then the top's not hearing it. It's my job as a chief to sit in that cabinet and push on the other chiefs to understand this is critical to the work we're doing systemically. It can't be that my office of engagement is just doing youth engagement, but rather we're pushing across all the offices to understand the critical nature of how we engage youth and families of youth for that matter. And it's a significant culture shift.
So in Chicago Public Schools, about 4 years ago, we started transitioning from service learning hours, which tended to sometimes tokenize our students, right, to kind of just do jobs for people, to actually doing projects that were based on the values and principles of our students and their communities and the things they cared about. To doing that is really, there's been some tensions around the quality of the projects. How can you really create these community responsive curriculum and just driving this work that you can't really have a checklist for, right? And so it's difficult to figure out how do we help guide that and not be formulaic, right? We've also seen tensions just around the fact that generally assessments are very individualistic. And if we're talking about transformational work, that's collective, right? And so as a classroom teacher, how do you go about creating assessments that will actually balance that when, you know, students are trained to sort of a lot of times just think about themselves and where they're going to end up. This type of work is very intergenerational, and our schools are not created that way, right? And so how are we creating spaces that invite community members, right, grandparents, family members, business people in the community to also inform the work? And how do we measure that, right? And lastly, the last one I'll mention is that a lot of this work tends to a lot of times be situated in social sciences and humanities, right? And last year we did about 240 projects as a district within high schools, and we have about 105 high schools, and over 140 of them were in the humanities. You know, and so that leaves 9 other disciplines that altogether did about 100 of them, right? And so as a previous science teacher, who I know when I think about environmental justice, when I think about the legacy of industry that is in Black and brown communities in Chicago, right? We need to really use our educational spaces to help mobilize our youth who want to act and improve their communities.
One of the things is even in the traditional civics classrooms, the way an issue is chosen and the teachers allow the students to explore this issue from multiple perspectives, the issues starting from the young people identifying not just what they are, but that young people become part of the learner, the instruction of the issue. We don't think of the opportunities for young people to bring in their lived experiences and to explore those issues because they actually know them better than some of the teachers who are trying to explore them, right? And so how can we change the way we think about exploring those issues in classrooms where young people's expertise and the expertise of their families and communities get welcomed in and brought in as part of the learning experience, I think is an important thing that we need to think about more. And that means it can't be answered with prepackaged curriculum, but that has to come and be generated together. So the young people who were talking earlier about co-creating really resonated with me as something that I think is, I would love to see more of. And then the second thing in terms of structural is, imagine this amazing classroom or this amazing after-school program where we're doing all the things, everything that we're saying, but then on your way to that classroom, you're walking through metal detectors, you're told to be quiet in the hallway, where's your ID, where do you belong? All of this kind of, we're structuring young people's experiences in school between classrooms as kind of really rigid and not just not democratic, anti-democratic ways of being. And then we say, go out in the world, believe us, your voice matters, but we don't want to hear it right now. Right? And so I think we have to address those contradictions within the school buildings and across classrooms, which means it can't just be social studies, but science and math and literature classrooms also have to be engaging these questions and creating these spaces, because otherwise I think we run the danger of young people saying, that's just you, or you're promising me false things that aren't real. And in some ways they're not real, but let's talk about how to make them happen. So I want to add that as well.
Part of what we've been talking about, I certainly have been doing it, is kind of talking about the ways in which activism can be a vehicle for well-being and kind of psychological health, and particularly in a context of injustice. But that can risk, I think, kind of psychologizing this process, and in other words, justifying it primarily as a vehicle for young people's learning and engagement, and where the outcome is on young people. But the only reason it is good for human development if the system is changing as well, if that makes sense. So I think what's been really powerful and beautiful to me about youth organizing or transformative student voice is there's a dialectical kind of interrelationship between systems change or school level change and the personal change, and they're constantly in tension. But if we lose the kind of change, the political change part, and it's just another way to promote social emotional learning or another way to keep students in school, that's going to not be true to, I think, what's been powerful about the stories and research we've heard about today.
I was going back today and thinking a tweet that I pinned to the top of my Twitter was from 2013 to 2017. There's been a 0.1% increase in tenured Black professors in higher education. 0.1%, virtually no increase. Right? We have all these initiatives. Everybody wants diversity, but nobody wants justice. And so if we think about what students are active about, they want the representation in the classroom. They want the curriculum, same curriculum they wanted in high school. They want that extended curriculum in college. They want to see and understand and learn in more deep ways about the actual issues that are affecting their lives and will affect their future lives. And so who's at the front of the classrooms, right? Who are in the administrative positions? The pipeline is not just leaking, it's washed, right? In the 55-year history of my program, my tenure package is in the system now. If I get tenure, second Black woman ever, right? This is problematic. And so for administrators, I say put your power where your mouth is. Diversity, okay, sure. Justice, right? Inclusion doesn't happen without justice. And diversity definitely won't be maintained at the student level, at the faculty level, and especially earlier it was mentioned about not just getting in, but getting through college and getting through with your life intact. I shouldn't have to get through by the skin of my teeth with my mental health in shambles, my physical health following down the drain to say, oh, I made it, when I was fighting tooth and nail against the institution that never wanted me to be there in the first place. I was supposed to be planting the bricks and washing the dishes and folding the sheets, right, at these institutions. So put your power where your mouth is. Thank you.